Hello and good morning, everybody. It's me, Julian. Welcome to the Monday morning live stream philosophy and theory lecture. I am so glad that you are here. The goal of today's lecture is to give you a primer, an introduction, as it were, to the Lacanian concept and theory of fantasy. This is a continuation of our lecture series on subjective destitution, which is part of the Complete Guide to Žižek series. Now, amongst other things today, we're going to be talking about the ultimate goal, if you will, of psychoanalytic treatment, which Žižek, in his book The Ticklish Subject, which I have right here, articulates as follows. On page 316, he says, "The ultimate aim of psychoanalytic treatment is for the subject to the ultimate aim of psychoanalytic treatment is for the subject to undo the ultimate passionate attachment that guarantees the consistency of his or her being, and thus to undergo what Lacan calls subjective destitution. At its most fundamental, the primordial passionate attachment to the scene of fundamental fantasy is not dialectizable, it can only be traversed." This is a fairly complicated argument, but I think that we can simplify it somewhat in the following lecture. And for those of you who have watched the previous two sessions, you will already have some idea as to what is meant by the fundamental fantasy and subjective destitution. So that's what we're going to be doing for the next 30 minutes or so, but I'm going to try to make it somewhat less complicated and use less jargon and some examples along the way. If you'd like to learn more about Slavoj Žižek, and if you're interested in my own writing, you can find the Complete Guide to Žižek ebook series, volumes 1 through 8, on my Patreon. And by purchasing that book, you also contribute to this channel and allowing me to keep hosting these sessions. So thank you very much. And above all, thank you for taking the time to watch this video on a Monday morning with me together. It means a lot to me that we are sort of sharing this live stream space. Okay, let us begin. So before we go to the ultimate aim of psychoanalytic treatment, I'd like to give you a quick primer on the Lacanian theory of fantasy. Because usually the way in which we understand fantasy, at least I think the way in which we're taught it in school and in life, is that fantasy is the opposite of what you might call reality. In other words, that we escape into fantasy so that we don't have to confront reality. The simple argument, the common sense logic as it were, being that we have the real world and the world of fantasy, and that those who escape into fantasy therefore leave the real world behind. This means that many sites of actual life are designated as being phantasmatic. For example, if you're a student, your professor might say to you, "Don't enjoy your time here too much because soon you're going to have to go out into the real world." Here we would have the idea that the university is a not real place detached from the symbolic order, a place of phantasmatic framing, but then we have to grow up and go into the real world. Or if somebody tells you that a child lives in fantasy but an adult lives in reality, or as often occurs somewhat pejoratively, that philosophers are accused of being people who say things in theory that don't function in practice. This binary division between reality and fantasy is, according to Lacan, itself the ultimate fantasy. The idea that we could separate a neat divide between the phantasmatic and reality is itself an illusion, is itself a fantasy. Now, against this, Lacan's argument is almost the exact opposite. Lacan argues that we only access reality by means of fantasy. In other words, we only access reality by means of superimposing a phantasmatic frame onto it. For example, when I was a child and I would read or watch comic books, I would imagine myself to be one of those characters, and then I would go out into the world pretending to be that character. I wouldn't tell anybody, but I would identify. I would practice symbolic identification with my favorite characters in my books. Likewise, there's a great passage in the autobiographical writings of the German author Thomas Mann, one of my favorites, where as a young man, he would pretend to be a prince. He had this, if you will, imaginary friend, which was himself, who he referred to as Prince Karl, and he would achieve a distinct pleasure, he said, of imagining himself to be some member of royalty, a prince who lived privately in his own world, and nobody would know. Hence, he would practice essentially symbolic identification with the idea of this fictional character of the prince. He would walk in the world pretending to be this prince, not by means of giving a false name, but simply imagining to himself that he was this other figure. Now, to simplify to the extreme, Lacan's argument is that this is how all subjectivity works. We symbolically identify with a character, if you will, with a mask, with a fantasy, that we then convince ourselves is us. But what's important here is that it's not a full psychotic attachment. It's not that you actually believe that you are this figure of your own creation. It's that by means of acknowledging the distance between you and the figure of your fantasy, that you access reality, that you walk in and through the world. And the paradox is therefore that this symbolic phantasmatic frame that you impose upon yourself so that it can be then imposed upon the world, i.e. you can access reality, creates a secondary effect, which is that essentially you believe that underneath this phantasmatic frame, there is nevertheless a real you, an authentic kernel to your being, as it were. And this is what Lacan characterizes as passionate attachment, which is to say, ironically, or paradoxically, is precisely the submission to the phantasmatic frame, the phantasmatic symbolic identification, that has as its outcome, its, if you will, symptom, that the subject nevertheless is allowed to believe that he has an inner kernel, that he has a passionate attachment to his very being. And now you can start piecing together Žižek's argument. He says, the ultimate aim of psychoanalytic treatment is for the subject to undo the ultimate passionate attachment that guarantees the consistency of his or her being. And the first way to undermine this passionate attachment is therefore to become aware of the relationship between this attachment and symbolic identification, or fantasy. But how exactly does fantasy function? Well, according to Lacan, fantasy is essentially dialectical, which is to say, we learn, let me try to simplify this somewhat more. Actually, let's go back, I'll explain this a little bit differently. Žižek's argument about cinema is that cinema is the ultimate pervert's art. You may have seen that quote before. And what Žižek means by cinema as the ultimate pervert's art is that it teaches us not what to desire, it teaches us how to desire. In other words, by means of watching a film, we imagine ourselves to be those characters, and we imagine what it would be like to live as they live, a kind of vicarious enjoyment, as it were. For example, a film that achieves this very well is the original Matrix. If you rewatch the original Matrix, you'll see that almost the entirety of the first hour is screenwritten in the second person. You are constantly being directly addressed as if you were Neo. In other words, you're experiencing the process of being identified as Neo. Neo is constantly being addressed in the second person. Another film that does this very effectively is Fight Club. In Fight Club, it appears as if you are directly being addressed. In fact, arguably, this is part of why both The Matrix and Fight Club have such a cult following, and to my mind also helps explain the reactionary, if you will, following that has emerged from it, in which viewers see within said films a master figure speaking to them. Hence, what happens within cinema is that you experience symbolic identification with the characters. But once again, what is crucial, absolutely crucial, is that this symbolic identification isn't achieved by means of a direct overlap. Instead, it's the very distance to the characters that allows you to identify with them. Žižek has an example that he mentions where he says, if you're watching a film in which an animal, for example, is being abused, if the animal is actually being abused in the film, it becomes extremely uncomfortable. You don't want to watch it. Whereas if the abuse is simply being simulated, then you identify with the animal, you identify with the hero who wants to save the animal, etc. Likewise, in a snuff movie, we would feel outraged, we would feel disgusted. We wouldn't want to watch people actually dying on screen. But if their death is simulated on screen, we actually find it quite pleasant and compelling to watch. Think about a sex sequence. If two people are making love on camera, If they were actually making love, we might feel a little bit vulgar about watching it. We wouldn't want to see it. But if they're simulating this passionate attachment, if you will, then we're actually comfortable with it. In other words, the fact that we know that what we're watching is being simulated, in other words, that there is a separation, a distance between our subjective experience of it and what is taking place, actually allows us to step into the frame, to make it a supplemental fantasy, as it were. Whereas if we were simply watching real life, it would be much more difficult to actually accomplish this. And to my mind, this is also part of what explains the effectiveness of like rap videos or the Kardashians. It's that in a rap video, the wealth and braggadocious displays of power are exaggerated, and everybody knows they're exaggerated, but it's the very theatricality of it that creates a kind of inner distancing towards the content that allows us to dream, that allows us to step into the fantasy frame, as it were. And I think the same is true like when it comes to all aspirational wealth content, whether it's the Kardashians or what you see on Instagram. It's the very ludicrous nature of it, precisely that it is not real, as it were, that it is staged for our enjoyment, that allows us to posit our imaginary self into it. If we were simply watching actual rich people living their actual rich lives, we might actually become resentful instead of treating it as a fantasy. Žižek's argument, to make this somewhat more complex, is that the same occurs when it comes to politics, all symbolic identification, which is to say we never directly identify with something. We always identify indirectly. For example, in the Catholic faith, you don't have to believe directly. You can believe in the saints who believe, in a sense, on your behalf. They are, to put it in Lacanian terms, the subjects who are supposed to believe. In the same way in psychoanalytic treatment, the psychoanalytic therapist is the subject supposed to know. He is the one who's supposed to have the answer in your stead. And the aim of psychoanalytic treatment is therefore to overcome this belief, to directly and radically assume your own knowledge. In the same way you could say that quote-unquote proper belief, although I wouldn't put it in such normative terms, is to overcome someone else believing for you, but to radically assume the act of belief yourself. Now, I've mentioned the word act here, and this is actually something that I want to flesh out a bit more. We might do in another lecture. But from a Lacanian perspective, the act and the ethical act is actually a key constitutive concept. So what is an act for Lacan? What constitutes an act? Well, strictly speaking, within Lacanian psychoanalysis, an act is that which retroactively changes the phantasmatic frame through which the act was viewed in the first place. Now, the easiest way to give you an example of that is that when you accomplish a properly ethical act, it changes the symbolic order, the framework, through which said act was valued or judged in the first place. For example, let's say that you're a bachelor, and the idea of having children is antithetical to what you imagine a good life to be. Going to bed whenever you want, waking up whenever you want, being free to do whatever you please. And then you have children. And seen from the perspective of the bachelor, having children is a disaster. It's catastrophe. It completely changes and upends your life. It destroys it, as it were. And yet, for most people, the act of having children changes what they believe to be important in the first place. And many parents will find themselves surprisingly content and happy doing things that they usually would have found extremely boring, like watching children play at the playground, etc. In other words, the act in Lacanian sense here transforms the perspective from which the act would have been originally judged in the first place. Now, there's also a political application to this. Any genuine act, therefore, is one that so profoundly breaks with the perceived norms that it retroactively restructures the symbolic order. I think we can see how this took place at the Republican Convention last week. What was on display at the Republican Convention would not have been possible even 10, 15 years ago. It would have been completely ludicrous. It would have been seen as the fringe of the fringe of the fringe. And yet, by means of Donald Trump's ethical act, and in this precise sense it is ethical not because it is good, it is ethical because it breaks the norms and thereby changes the very normative structure through which such acts are perceived, suddenly it became acceptable for fringe characters to behave in the way they did at the convention. In other words, what Trump accomplished, which is why Slavoj Žižek likes to refer to him as the obscene master, is that he breaks through these norms and thereby essentially recreates the Republican Party in his own image. And I think that this is something that's actually quite important to note, even from a revolutionary perspective. The reason that a revolutionary doesn't simply want incremental change is that incremental change nevertheless functions under the umbrella of what exists as the status quo. Whereas a properly revolutionary, i.e. ethical act, is that which itself changes the coordinates according to what we believe is possible or not possible. In this sense, Alain Badiou's theory of the event corresponds to Lacan's theory of the ethical act. An event is something which disrupts our inner unity, our sense of ideal, so extremely that suddenly things that were completely inconceivable become conceivable. In other words, the properly revolutionary stance is not simply to accomplish change within what can be imagined, but to change the very framework within which things become imaginable in the first place, which is a much more radical restructuring of the subject, as it were. The revolutionary theory of terror and political violence, which I should be very clear I do not endorse, is closely related to this. The idea or assumption being that a terror essentially induces an event in which new things can be built, that you have to burn it down to build it up again. Once again, I'm not a proponent of this theory, but there are connections to be made. Now let's take a step back for a moment, because I'm introducing a lot of concepts here. Fantasy for Lacan is how we access reality, which is to say the phantasmatic frame is imposed upon reality so that we can recognize ourselves as an agent within it. However, the secondary effect of this phantasmatic frame is that it creates the illusion that underneath the symbolic identification there is an authentic kernel to the subject's very being, what is known as the fundamental fantasy. This means that symbolic identification is never complete or direct. After all, if symbolic identification were completely immersive, the fundamental fantasy would itself disappear. You would over-identify with the other. Against this, the Lacanian argument is that in order to overcome, or what he calls traverse the fundamental fantasy as to the inner kernel of one's being, what he designates as a passionate attachment, one has to therefore first understand the extent to which reality is only accessed through fantasy. Hence, the Lacanian argument in its most radical form is that if we change or alter the phantasmatic frame, we will change reality itself. And therein you can see what is a tacitly revolutionary message, although not made explicit by Lacan and certainly highlighted by Slavoj Žižek more than in the Lacanian theory. The way in which you change reality is by means of changing the phantasmatic frame. And if we change the phantasmatic frame, we thereby change the symbolic identification, which therein changes the fundamental fantasy. And so that's the simplest way to give you that as a formula. And yet, nevertheless, as is true with philosophy, often the simplification makes it more complicated. So let's talk for a moment about the big other. One of the most important features of the big other for Lacan is that we aren't simply integrated into the big other in like perfect harmony. This would be itself a kind of fantasy. Instead, what properly integrates us into the big other, the symbolic order, is precisely our resistance to it, precisely our distance to it. Which is to say, our very resistance to the idea of the symbolic order is what attaches us properly to it. In fact, according to Lacan, the very idea that you are different from other people is, in a sense, what makes you like other people. The sense that you have this precious kernel within you that differentiates you from others. Hence, ironically, what allows us to practice symbolic identification, to behave like other people, is precisely the belief that we are different, that we are unique ourselves. Now, this is not to say that this is part of the cultural criticism that, everyone believes that they're special and precious, the coddling of the American mind, etc. It has nothing to do with that. Instead, it's the dialectical problem, hence why Žižek, as I already said, on page 317 says, the fundamental fantasy is not dialectizable. Now, what makes the fundamental fantasy not dialectizable? Well, it's that we are integrated into the symbolic order precisely because we believe ourselves to be exempt from it. Hence, this dialectic of being inside because we believe ourselves to be outside is not something which resolves itself, but further integrates us into the symbolic order. Hence why the fundamental fantasy can only be traversed, not dialectized. At least that's how I interpret Žižek's passage here. And the way in which we recognize ourselves in the symbolic order, as I alluded to in last week's lecture, is by means of what Althusser deemed ideological interpolation. And what's important to note here, and I didn't fully flesh this out last time, is that ideological interpolation isn't simply the fact that within contemporary life, we exist online, we exist through our medical records, we might be in the phone book. If you type in somebody's name, you can probably find their address and how much their property is worth on a real estate website, etc. This isn't really what Althusser means by ideological interpolation. In other words, it's not simply that we exist in the symbolic and are reified through it. Of course, there is an aspect to that as well. Instead, the properly radical insight of the Althusserian theory of ideological interpolation is that we recognize ourselves in the symbolic order precisely when we are not addressed. Precisely where we are not, therein we see ourselves. Here you can already see a little bit the relationship between the Althusserian theory and the Lacanian reworking of the Cartesian cogito. Namely, not I think, therefore I am, but I am where I do not think, I think where I am not. In other words, the subject, and this is the core feature of phantasmatic framing, posits himself in the gap of ideological interpolation. Žižek actually has a funny anecdotal example for this. He talks about a theater performance in which a member of the public is too late. He was stuck in traffic. And he happens to enter into the theater at the exact moment that one of the actors is saying the line, "Why are you late? I need my silence." And understandably, of course, the member of the public entering into the theater believes that that line was intended for him. And so he makes a complete fool of himself by walking up to the front of the theater and starting to explain himself why he was late, that traffic was bad, etc. And everyone is surprised. Why is this crazy person interrupting the procedure? Here we have for Žižek the fundamental truth of interpolation. It is that you recognize or hear yourself in the other. It appears as if the other is speaking to you, as if you are being addressed. Now, of course, if you completely give in to this, you end up a psychotic. Like, let's say that you're watching a cheerleader during a football game, and the cheerleader winks at the camera, and you believe that she is winking at you, and you develop an intense, erotic attachment to that person to the point of stalking them, etc. Here we would have a psychotic immersion in the other. You directly believe in it. And yet, fundamentally, what happens with an ideological interpolation is that we posit ourselves in the gap presented by the other's interpolation, and this positing is what itself sustains the ideological fantasy that we have a self. In other words, symbolic identification. Namely, when somebody says that they are doing their work for God, it doesn't mean that they directly expect to be acknowledged by God, at least in most cases. It's that doing it for God creates the symbolic framework against which they can imagine themselves doing something in the first place. In other words, it releases them. It gives them their own autonomous ethical agency to be a person or a subject in the world. Hence, the big other, as Lacan insisted over and over again, does not exist, and yet this very non-existence is what accomplishes the process by which the subject places himself in this gap so as to, and this is crucial, cover up a fundamental void or gap within the subject himself. This is what is called symbolic identification. Hence why symbolic identification is dialectically interrelated to the passionate attachment that the subject has to what he believes to be the kernel of his own being, which itself covers up a gap, a void. Now, there are many ways in which I think that this happens on a day-to-day basis, and none of this has to be negative or bad necessarily. To simplify somewhat, we all need a reason to exist. We all need a reason to do things. The problem, however, is what occurs when we become overly dependent on the interpolation of the other. In other words, when we become hysterics. Who am I to you? What do I mean to you? What do you want from me? If the subject cannot properly discern what he or she believes to be the imperative of the other, the big other, she or he or they or whatever will essentially respond hysterically. And the problem is that this very hystericism then becomes the symbolic attachment the subject has towards himself. We can even see this in political terms. For example, many progressives who essentially protest and complain about the status quo do so in a way that tacitly expects that they will be told that nothing will change. In other words, being radical and being a progressive becomes a very part of their identity. And in a sense, the worst thing that you could do would be to give in to their demands. The worst thing that could happen to this type of progressive, and I recognize that this is a straw man argument, but forgive me for a moment as we lay out the layers here. The progressive in this sense would exist only in his resistance to the status quo. And if there were to be some concession, the progressive would actually resist it because this would take away his identity as being the loyal resistance, as it were. Hence, the problem here is that the identity of being against something becomes the overarching identity that obscures what you are for. In other words, the liberal stance is precisely to be essentially pessimistic and cynical about what can be accomplished, and this cynicism marks you as an enlightened progressive subject who nevertheless continues to participate. Hence, this very distancing is what draws you further in. The very idea that you are outside of it is what creates the conditions by which you participate in it. Hence why the cynical stance, which believes itself to be critical, nevertheless always facilitates the status quo. Cynicism in this sense stands radically against any genuinely or authentic progressive urge. The progressive belief is precisely that everything has to change. The cynical stance is everything has to change in order to remain the same. Now, to take it away from the political for a moment, how does this relate to subjective destitution, which is after all the key theme of our lecture today? Well, let's go back to the passage on page 316 and 17 of the Ticklish Subject, Žižek's follow-up work to The Sublime Object of Ideology. And I should also note the book which he believes to be more important than The Sublime Object of Ideology. It is certainly also more difficult. Now, I'm going to read out the passage one more time. The ultimate aim of psychoanalytic treatment is for the subject to undo the ultimate passionate attachment that guarantees the consistency of his or her being, and thus to undergo what Lacan calls subjective destitution. In other words, subjective destitution is the process by which what appears to guarantee the consistency of the subject's very being, namely the phantasmatic frame, both which integrates him into the symbolic order, the big other, and which guarantees the supposedly authentic kernel of his passionate attachment, the fundamental fantasy, this is what has to be rejected. This is what has to be traversed. Now, how do you traverse this fundamental fantasy? Well, what's important to note, and I really have to stress this, is that Žižek says that strictly speaking, you can't fully practice subjective destitution. To fully practice destitution would be an almost psychotic stance. It would be to completely give yourself away. This means that the only way to live, according to Žižek's interpretation of subjective destitution, is to impose a libidinal economy, if you will, to use a jargon-laden word for a moment, upon the act of traversing the fantasy. In other words, to become the master of your fantasy, to realize how the phantasmatic frame works. Therefore, to effectively choose or impose your own phantasmatic frame so as to create your own reality. Not, and I must be very clear here, not so as to escape into fantasy, but precisely so as to change the way in which you access reality. If you take a camera and you consider yourself a photographer and you go out into the world, reality will look different because you want to capture it. If you are a writer and you listen to people having conversations, their conversations will sound different because you are listening to them with a writerly ear. If you are a philosopher, you are looking at politics and the world around you in a different way because you are thinking about it critically through a conceptual lens. In other words, Žižek's argument is not to fully undergo subjective destitution, but instead to traverse the fundamental fantasy to the extent that you can choose your own mask. And by means of being the active agent of the phantasmatic frame, you can thereby access reality and create reality in a manner in which you find to be acceptable to you. Crucially, the revolutionary underpinnings of this argument are that if we were to collectively do so, if we were to collectively reframe, as it were, our phantasmatic frame, then reality itself would change. Hence, we are not the passive agents of a cruel reality, and we have to flee into fantasy. It is that we are the active agents of fantasy, and therein we can change reality. That is Žižek's argument. Next week, I'm going to explain why this argument is a properly materialist argument. That is next week's lecture. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you'd like to learn more about Žižek, you can download the complete guide to Žižek ebook series, which I posted to my Patreon, volumes 1 through 8. After every Intro to Žižek lecture series, I essentially put together an ebook that summarizes the lectures. And so if you'd like to read back all those lectures in a concise form, they're about 100 pages each, you can find that on Patreon. Until then, I'll see you next week.